Welcome to Boise State in the Community. I'm your host, Natasha Williams. Now, Boise State in the Community is not just a show, and it's not just a class. It's a service learning class, and part of our service learning is we get to bring in esteemed guests from Boise State's movers and shakers, and tell their stories. Now, my guest today has been teaching in the public sector for nearly a decade. She is partnering with grad students to better science education, and she had the opportunity to turn a hobby of hers into an actual class here at Boise State. Now, please join me in welcoming my guest, Dr. Julianne Wenner.
Hi.
Hi, it's so excellent to have you on the show tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, turning your hobby, which is sewing and quilting and things like that, into an actual class, I mean, that must have been so exciting for you.
It was really exciting. It was also very strange, and several people were like, "Whew, I can't believe students are going to get credit for doing that." But there was some rigor behind it, and so it was a lot of fun.
So how did you get involved with kind of creating a class like that?
It was a student that I had in a doctoral research course, and he said, "Oh, I think you should teach an honors course." I went to Dr. Shelton Woods and talked to him about teaching an honors course, and he said, "Gosh, if you woke up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and you had the whole day ahead of you, what would you do?" It was right after the election, so I was a little fired up about politics. And I also like to sew and quilt and cross stitch and all of that. And there was the pussy hats and there was subversive cross stitch going on. And I thought, oh, that's what I would do with my day. So I started researching craftivism, which is craft and activism melded together, and just kind of went from there. I took the Center for Teaching and Learning Course Design Institute 1.0, and they helped me think about how to make this not just a cross-stitch course, but really a rigorous course that had some content behind it. It was so much fun.
And, you know, a variety of students too, of course, of different skill sets.
Oh, absolutely. So we had students of all majors. We had education, business, everything in between. And on the very first day, I had my students stitching a Changemaker card. So these were cards that were produced by the Craftivist Collective, and they had different people's faces on it. So they had J.K. Rowling, and they had Eleanor Roosevelt, and what they had done is turn the faces into a dot-to-dot. So I used that to teach my students how to do a very simple backstitch. And I thought, oh, this is doable. And on the very first day, within the very first half an hour, we had students who couldn't thread a needle, and there were piles of yarn and knots and craziness everywhere. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a really long semester. But I also had students that were amazing at all of this. I had one student in my class who has her own Etsy shop for embroidery. And so a lot of my students really stepped up and helped the folks that were struggling. So it was cool.
Right. And, you know, I think that it's really interesting, this idea of craftivism and giving students really an outlet to kind of express their views. So the final project, I asked students to do their own craftivist project. So they had to research some sort of local cause that they were interested in. And then we had different flavors of craftivism, as I called them, so different types. So you could be protesting, or you could be raising funds and awareness. And so everybody researched something that they loved. So we had environmental activism, we had the Meridian Canine Rescue, we had Women's and Children's Alliance, so there was a variety of things. And what was exciting is there were a lot of students that just thought, and they reflected quite often, they said, you know, I'm really passionate about these things. I don't want to go out and protest. I don't want to go out and yell at people. I don't want to make phone calls and cold call for money. But I can make a hat for a refugee, or I can make a snuffle mat for the Meridian Canine Rescue for the dogs in there. And a lot of them felt empowered because they felt like there was finally a way that they could participate that resonated with their soul. It was cool. And at the very end, you all had this opportunity to kind of put all of this skill set together into a big quilt.
Yeah, so that was actually one of the skills labs that we had. So throughout the course, I had the students, I mean, they can't do craftivism if they can't do the craft piece. Right. So I did skills labs. So I taught them cross stitch and I taught them embroidery, and they had little things that they had to do. And they had to do a quilt square, a 9-patch quilt square. I chose orange and blue and white for obvious reasons.
Of course.
And I looked up Project Linus. So the local Project Linus you can just donate whatever size blanket. They have some specs on their website. And these are blankets that are just for kiddos who are having a rough time, or they might have a terminal illness. And so I gave my students the specs. We went to the Maker Lab in the library, so they learned how to use the sewing machines. It was very exciting. And they turned them into me, and then I put them all together and quilted it.
And what does that mean to you, being able to do something like that for kids?
It was a really nice, tangible way. I think more than anything, I think it gave the students a sense that this was a real thing. I think even until that point, there were a lot of students that were like, yeah, I don't know about this class. Like, this is kind of a cake class. I don't know that there's anything meaningful. Sure, you cross-stitch something. But I think when they saw everything come together, I would like to think that that was really powerful. And I like the idea that Boise State is giving back to the community.
And so, you know, all of this hands-on kind of new material and different kinds of ways to teach. In your early teaching days, I mean, you kind of have said that you don't feel that you were very much that way as a teacher.
Oh no. So when I first started teaching, I was a terrible teacher. And I tell my students that if I could go back to my first class and apologize to them, I would. My first job was a middle school science teacher, and I had never planned on being a science teacher. I got my job in a very odd way. And so when I was hired, I was given no materials, no books, no lab supplies, nothing, and I was expected to teach science. And I thought, okay, well, I'll teach from a book, because that's how I learned, and I didn't know what else to do, and nobody was mentoring me. And God help those poor kids. Yeah, so I was pretty bad. I would like to think that I improved over time, but even now I look back on kind of my later years of teaching and think, oh, I could have done that better.
Right. And so I think that we were talking about how with the hands-on and all of these different kinds of students, different learning types. So at the beginning, you know, learning to do all of that, that must have been really overwhelming.
In the craftivism course?
Sorry, no, in your early teaching days.
Oh, in my early teaching days, yes. It was super overwhelming to learn how to do everything. There were days that I hid under my desk and cried during my planning period. It was super hard.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there was one teacher for you that kind of, I think a lot of us have a teacher in our life that kind of changes everything. And there was a teacher for you that changed everything and changed the way that you look at teaching.
Absolutely. It was actually one of my colleagues, so it wasn't a teacher who taught me as, you know, teacher-student relationship, but she was my colleague. So Kathy Grimm, who is still teaching in Bradenton, Florida, was my co-teacher the first year that I taught in Florida, and changed my life. She showed me that science should not be taught from a book, exclusively at least, and that you can make it fun and engaging and relevant. She was very willing to share all of her handouts or ideas or activities. We stayed after school and planned together and ate chocolate together, and we both cheered each other on, and it was a really great partnership.
So how did she kind of teach you, I suppose, how science should be taught?
I think it was a lot of modeling. I think she kind of showed me how it should be. And we also tried to attend any sort of workshops that we could. Also during that time, I started my master's degree in science education because I knew that I had a lot of gaps in my knowledge. And so I think a combination of all of those things really helped out.
And so I think that we were talking a little bit about, there was a resource for you that kind of helped as well.
Yeah, so I discovered the NSTA community. So NSTA is National Science Teachers Association. And I wish I would have known more about this my first year. It's a great community. It's all vetted by researchers in science ed, so it's not just like Joe Schmo on the internet. They have lots of great publications, conferences, online forums. It's fantastic. I actually use, they have an online learning center, and that's what I use for my e-text in my methods course here on campus.
So as far as kind of moving back to the idea of crafts in the classroom, so there's kind of been this image circling around about Oreos and filling out the cream and kind of talking about phases of the moon. And so what's your opinion on projects like that.
It kills my soul a little bit. So I actually just talked with my students about this morning. You know what? There's nothing wrong with Oreo moons if the students understand the mechanism by which the phases of the moon happen, and that's just a little add-on. What happens so frequently, and for folks at home that don't know what this is, so what teachers often do is they have the students twist the Oreos off and take a little toothpick and scrape off the cream so it looks like the 8 different phases of the moon. And then they label them and they say, ta-da, I learned the phases of the moon. Except kids don't know how that happened. They don't know where the light is coming from. They don't know why it changes. Maybe they think it's clouds or it's reflecting off of something. And so when we're substituting arts and crafts for the content, that's an issue for me. Now, let's say the kids understood all the content and the teacher wanted to reward them and do kind of a food-themed little party at the end, and here's a little moon thing. Great. But I think what's happened a lot is elementary teachers have not been supported, and so they go to wherever they can get something, and too often it's Pinterest. And Pinterest is great for many things, but I don't know that it's always so great at supporting teaching content.
Right. And we're going to go to a quick break really quick, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the way that Dr. Wenner believes her students should teach. And we're going to go more in depth about Grace Jordan, which is their hands-on project. So we'll be right back. This is Boise State in the Community.
Looking at the big blue sky, thinking where the you and I will ever fall in love. I know for me, it'll be so.
Boise State!
Welcome back to Boise State in the Community. I'm your host, Natasha Williams. Before we went to break, we were talking a little bit about how Dr. Wenner gets her students involved in hands-on activities while actually teaching the concepts behind them. Now please join me in welcoming back my guest, Dr. Julianne Wenner. Welcome back.
Hi.
Thank you. So talk to me a little bit about your work here at Boise State. I mean, what's a typical day look like for you?
Well, it looks different every single day, which is what makes my job super fun. But when I'm teaching, a typical day is that we do something that is hands-on, that there's some sort of concept embedded in there with the content. So for example, today, we were talking about teaching science to all students. So students with disabilities, students who are linguistically diverse, all students can learn science. And so I gave my students each group had a little profile of a learner that might have some interesting needs in the classroom. And then we just did an inquiry lesson on bouncing light with a laser off of a mirror and talking about the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection and light travels in a straight line and all of that. So we did that, and then we were done, and I said, okay, now let's put our teacher hats on. What would have been difficult for the student that you were, you had the little profile for, and how could you overcome this? And so what I try to do is there's a little bit of content, there's a little bit of pedagogy, and they get to experience it, and then we put our teacher hats on and we talk about it.
And so for those who don't know, pedagogy is?
So pedagogy is how you go about teaching, right? So the different strategies that you use to get the content across.
So essentially, just to make sure I understand, so with, for example, the laser lights, teaching them verbally versus teaching them with examples?
So thinking about the way that I go about teaching is inquiry. So I think many of us were taught science in a very rote, straightforward way. So we memorized vocabulary, we wrote stuff down, we copied things out of the book. That is not inquiry. So what inquiry is my students got to play around things. I just started off with, what do you know about lasers? What do you know about mirrors? Why don't you kind of dink around with them for a little bit and see what you can figure out? And then they come to me and they say, oh yeah, so it did this with the laser, and this is the same angle as this. Oh, okay, let's talk about what that means. That's the angle of incidence and the angle of reflection. So the way that you go about structuring kind of your whole lesson would be your pedagogy or your different strategies.
It's almost kind of this idea of, in journalism, you have to be kind of naturally curious, and science is almost the same way.
It is, yeah, and unfortunately I think a lot of how science has been taught in the past has beaten that curiosity out of our kids. And so what I'm trying to do is teach my students how they can encourage and support curiosity in kiddos.
And why is that curiosity so essential to have?
Man, that's what makes the world go around, and this is how we get new ideas, and this is how we have different perspectives on things. I think too often we ask students to memorize a bunch of terms that mean nothing to them, and they're not going to learn that, and they're not going to care about it. But when they're curious and they get to follow their own questions, they buy in. They're excited, right? Think about anything that you're excited about. You want to keep going deeper and often little rabbit holes and whatever. And it's something that you pursue for a lifetime.
Right. And so this kind of opens up doors for them to kind of discover more about who they are and what they're interested actually.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's so fascinating. So your students, you're part of a service learning class as well, which is really, really cool. And so your students have an actual opportunity to teach real live kids.
Mm-hmm. So actually, my science methods course is not a service learning course. My craftivism course was. But the course that I have with my science methods, what I did is in using a model that I used when I was in grad school at the University of Georgia. It's called the Supported Collaborative Teaching Model. And there are lots of different moving pieces to it, but essentially my students get to go out 3 times each semester and teach real K-6 students science. They do it in quick little 15-minute lessons, and then the kids rotate to a new center. So it's like 4 centers going on in a classroom. And what's nice about that is my students get to teach the same lesson like 8 times in one day. And while that might sound boring, it actually is kind of exciting because they get to tweak something each time and keep improving and keep improving, and let me try this and see what happens and how the kids respond. And maybe if I introduce the materials this way, they'll respond in a different way. And I found that to be really powerful for my students, because in real life, you don't get that kind of do-over, right? Also, it's pretty low risk. My students are working with 4 or 5 elementary kids at a time. They don't have to worry about management. They don't have to worry about a big class thing. And my students get to work with different grade levels over the semester. So like 1st grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade. And so I've had students say, man, I never thought I wanted to work with the littles, but I love the 1st graders. This is great. I want to go play with that. What's particularly powerful about all of that, though, is I think often what happens in education courses is they do things called micro-teaching or peer teaching. And so I would be teaching you as I would be teaching an elementary student, except you're not an elementary student.
Right.
And you could fake it and be obnoxious if you wanted to and whatever, but it's not going to be the same.
Right.
You're not going to have the same questions or the same little rabbit holes or the same misunderstandings, because developmentally you're different. And so what's powerful is my students go out and they teach real kids and they're like, oh, they really are curious. Oh, they really do think this is interesting. Oh, I get it. Because I could tell them all day that this works, or they could teach their peers all day, but it's not the same. So this seems to be almost a jumping off point, at least my students have told me in the past, that they feel like they can actually teach science once they're in the classroom.
And so some of your students, you've told me, they feel a little bit nervous about teaching science. So
oh, yes.
what's that? What's teaching them about like, or sorry, what is teaching them like when, you know, they're so nervous?
Yeah, so the first day of class, I always start off, give me one word about how you feel about teaching science. And it's usually a 50-50 split. I've got half of the class saying, I'm super excited, I'm jazzed, this is gonna be so fun. And the other half of the class saying like, I'm nervous, I'm anxious. I believe one person this semester said dread, right? They dread teaching science. And so I kind of talk to them after I look through all of that and say, it's okay if it doesn't become your favorite subject. That's okay with me, that's fine. I just want you to feel like you can do it. I want you to know what the tools are, and I want you to understand that it's not scary and that you're capable. If it is not your favorite and you love math so much more, that's fine. But I want you to see the power of teaching science well. And so that's kind of how we approach it. And I would like to say that I think for most students, I at least move them along that confidence continuum.
And so at the end of the semester, do you find that attitudes have usually changed?
Yeah, which is cool. And I love reading the comments on their evals. It's just really powerful. And I think, honestly, the thing that does it is not all of my teaching through the semester, but it's going out and having them teach the kids. That is the most powerful thing for them.
So I was actually wondering, do teachers, this is gonna sound really stupid, but do teachers get stage fright? You know, like actors get stage fright, or do they really?
Oh yes, and I think teaching is very much like acting, right? You have to be ready to put on a show, and it doesn't matter what's happening in your life, you have to be ready to perform. I think a lot of our students, particularly as they're learning and they just want so badly to do things right, they'll sit there with their lesson plan and they'll read to the students like this and try to figure out if they're asking the right questions until they get comfortable. And so I think it is nerve-wracking. And so I think being with the elementary kiddos, it takes away an element of like, oh, they're not super scary. Like, I can do this, it's okay.
Right. And so talk to me about the very first time that your students, got to go out and really teach kids. What were some of the things that you noticed?
I try to notice, so what I try to do is have my students focus on just one component, or actually we build on it each time. So one component, then 2, then 3, as we go out. And so the very first time they go out, I tell them everything else can crash and burn, but I want you to focus on your quality of questions and your discussion techniques with kids. So are you asking open-ended questions? Are you probing students for more? It's very similar to having an interview. Are you asking for their reasoning? Are you allowing them to kind of go down that path? Or are you just saying like, right, good, and then moving on? And so I kind of push them to do that. So a lot of students, again, because it's pretty low stakes, I'm like, everything else can be terrible. That's fine. They come away saying, yeah, I did those questions okay. That's all right. Or I didn't do that so great this time, but I know what I'm going to ask next time. So I see a lot of that. I do see a lot of nerves in reading off of the lesson plan, but it's fun to see them over the course of 2 hours kind of come out of their shell and hit a groove, and that's a lot of fun.
So in order to make your students better teachers, you've actually entered a really, really cool partnership with other grad students. So as part of your NSF grant, you get to essentially have science majors, science grad students teach your science teacher students.
I like to think of it as a giant game of telephone. Yes. So we got an NSF, a National Science Foundation, Innovations in Graduate Education grant this past fall. Myself, Paul Simmons, who is in Physics and Material Science, Megan Frary, who's in Material Science, and Donna Llewellyn, who's in the Institute for STEM and Diversity Initiatives. And what Paul and I had done in the past is we just had his physics graduate students teach my students content. Because my course should be, at its core, a pedagogy course, so about the teaching strategies. It shouldn't be about the content, but gosh, they don't get enough content in their time here, because they can't possibly be experts in everything. So I had Paul's grad students teach my students some content at an adult level, because a lot of teachers think like, I'm teaching first graders, so I only need to know the content at a first grade level. And actually that's not true. The more you understand the content at a really deep level, the better you can structure your lessons. You can be thoughtful about the materials or how you question or whatever. So they learn the content on an adult level, but then they transform that into a lesson for elementary students. So in the past, it's only been Paul's students, so they're material science, physics graduate students. The grant is going to allow us to scale up. So in the fall, we will start working with biology, and then we'll bring geosciences and engineering on board as well.
And we will look forward to all of that experience in the fall. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Wenner, and thank you so much for joining us as well. I'd like to thank my producer, Benny Miller, my director, Carson Shank, and of course his crew, our studio manager, Bryce Cornwell. And tune in next week, my colleague, Emma Richardson, will tell us why there's a bunch of Boise State students running around Belize. This has been Boise State in the Community. I'm Natasha Williams. Drive safely, everyone.